So this is where people end up when they can't hold down a real job. Meredith Vance let out a weak laugh as the small bakery door clicked shut behind her. The man in the flour-dusted apron by the oven was Carlos Mendoza, the single father she had fired weeks earlier for taking a few days off to care for his ailing mother. She remarked, almost sweetly, that he had finally found work baking for someone else. Carlos only smiled. He never mentioned that he owned this place, nor that within days the entire country would know his name. Carlos Mendoza had spent 11 years learning the difference between something that was almost right and something that was exactly right, and the difference had never made him rich. At Overin Foods, he ran quality control on a factory floor the size of 2 football fields, walking the line before dawn while the ovens were still cold, testing, measuring, sending back entire batches when a crust came out a shade too pale. Men twice his age called him careful, the younger ones called him slow. He answered both the same way, with a brief nod and a quieter insistence that the work be done correctly, because he had learned young that being reliable was the only currency he could truly trust. He was 35 and woke early every morning in a small rented house on the outskirts of town. He made coffee he rarely finished and drove to a job he did well and didn't love. What he loved lived somewhere beneath all of that, tucked away like a recipe card he no longer had the courage to read. Years earlier he had wanted to cook. He had wanted, more specifically and more foolishly, to own a bakery. A real one, with his own name on the glass and his own bread in the window. He'd told almost no one. A dream you never say aloud can never be ridiculed. And Carlos had spent a long time protecting his from laughter. The person who laughed at Overin Foods when laughter was required was Meredith Vance. She had taken control of the company young, younger than anyone expected. And wore that fact like armor, daring anyone to test her. For Meredith, a business was a breathing spreadsheet. And every person inside it was a number that went up or down. She wasn't cruel in the theatrical way that creates easy villains. She was worse, in a sense, because she was efficient. She could end a man's livelihood in the time it took to close a laptop, and she could do it without ever raising her voice, and she sincerely believed this restraint made her fair. Carlos had worked under her for 3 years without ever really being seen by her. He was a line on a report labeled Quality Assurance, consistently green, and green numbers don't require attention. He preferred it that way. He arrived earlier than asked and left later than paid and assumed, in the simple arithmetic of a decent man, that this ledger of loyalty was being kept somewhere, that it counted, that it would protect him if the day came when he needed protection. That assumption was the most expensive thing he owned, and he still didn't know it. The day it came due began with a phone call at 4 a.m., the kind of call that sounds different from all others. His mother, Margarita, had collapsed in her kitchen. She lived 40 minutes away, alone in the house where Carlos had grown up, and had raised him single-handedly through years so lean that he still couldn't throw away bread without a small flinch of guilt. Now the woman who had gone without so he wouldn't have to was in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and a chart full of words he couldn't pronounce. And the doctors were using the careful, weighted language people use when they're preparing you for the worst without quite saying it. Carlos didn't think about Overin Foods in that hospital room. He thought about it later, in the hallway, with a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand, when he realized he would need time. Not much, a few days. Enough to transfer her, to talk to specialists, to sit with her so she wouldn't be scared and alone. He called the office before the sun was fully up. He left a message explaining clearly and honestly what had happened and asked for a brief leave, the kind he had every reason to believe he'd earned. He drove in 3 days later to sign the proper paperwork, still unshaven, still running on the edge of sleep deprivation, and was told the meeting he'd scheduled had been moved. It had been moved to the open floor, in front of the shift managers, in front of the very people he had trained, corrected, and covered for over the years. Meredith was waiting there with a folder she didn't need to open because she already knew what was inside. She told him, in front of all of them, that his absence had cost the department a critical audit window. She said the word reliability like a person setting down something heavy. She said a man who disappeared when things got hard wasn't a man a company could build around. Carlos tried to explain about his mother, about the hospital, about the message he'd left. And Meredith raised a hand, not brusquely, just enough, and told him everyone had a reason, and reasons didn't run a business. "We need people who show up," she said. "You didn't." He stood there under the flat fluorescent light while she thanked him for his years of service in the same tone she might have used to decline a lunch invitation. And he understood that the ledger he had trusted, The careful record of every early morning and every unpaid hour had never existed anywhere except in his own head. There was no line on any report for the mornings he'd arrived before the ovens warmed. There was only the window he'd missed and the woman who decided he was a liability and the small cluster of familiar faces staring at their shoes because they didn't know where else to look. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't exactly pride. It was that his voice wouldn't have held. He returned his badge, said something low that no one quite caught, and walked out through a door he'd passed through more than 2,000 times. And in the second it closed behind him, he stopped being a man with a career and became a man with a problem. The weeks that followed were the kind he wouldn't describe to anyone afterward, not even when the description might have earned him sympathy. His mother's care wasn't cheap, and the savings he'd accumulated, one careful paycheck at a time, began to drain away in a way that made him understand for the first time why his own mother flinched at wasted bread. He sent applications. He sat in waiting rooms across from men who held his resume in their hands and a certain expression on their faces. And he learned that in a town this size, word travels fast. And the word about Carlos Mendoza was that he'd abandoned a good job when he was most needed. The truth didn't matter. The shape had already hardened. He might have taken any job that came. He'd nearly resigned himself to it. To the long, slow rebuild, to explaining himself interview after interview to people who'd already decided. What stopped him wasn't ambition. It was a Tuesday and a drive he took for no other reason than to be moving, and a building on the wrong end of Fuller Street with butcher paper in its windows and a sign on the door saying, in lettering already fading, that the place was closing forever. It had been a bakery. Once. He could see the ghost of it through the glass. The long empty display cases, the cold ovens along the wall, the worn tile floor worn in a path where someone had stood for years doing the one thing Carlos had always wanted to do. He stood on the sidewalk longer than a sensible man would have, and the dream he'd kept and never said aloud began very quietly to unpeel. He knew every reason it was foolish. He was unemployed. His mother was sick. His savings were a fraction of what they'd been, and what remained was the only thing standing between him and genuine trouble. Buying a failing bakery at the exact moment his life had fallen apart wasn't a plan. It was the opposite of a plan. Any honest advisor would have told him to keep the money, take the first stable job that came, and leave the dream tucked away where it couldn't hurt him. He called the number on the sign that same afternoon. The woman who answered sounded tired. The way people sound when they've already mourned a thing before losing it. Her name was Nora, and she'd run the place for a long time, and her hands, when he met her the next morning, had the permanent wrinkles of white flour, the kind someone stops noticing are there. She showed him through the building with a flashlight because half the lights had gone. She showed him the oven that still worked and the two that didn't. She didn't exaggerate the virtues. She told him plainly what was broken and what would break soon. And then she stood in the middle of the empty floor and told him she'd hoped it would go to someone who understood what it had been. "It's not a good investment," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. But it was a good bakery. There's a difference, and most people can't tell it." Carlos told her he could tell the difference. It was, he realized as he said it, the truest thing he'd said in weeks. He took what money he had left, the careful savings meant to be a wall between his mother and disaster, and spent nearly all of it. He did the arithmetic a dozen times, and not once was it reassuring. He signed the papers in a lawyer's office that smelled of old coffee, and when it was done, he sat in his truck in the parking lot and put his hands on the wheel and didn't drive anywhere for a long while because he'd just bet the last solid ground under his feet on something everyone in his life would have told him not to do. He drove to the hospital that afternoon and told his mother. He hadn't planned it. He'd planned to protect her from it. To let her believe he'd found something stable, because the last thing a sick woman needs is a reason to worry about the son who's supposed to be worrying about her. But she looked at him across the pale hospital sheets and asked what he'd done, because mothers can read a face the way Carlos could read a crust, and he found he couldn't lie to her. He told her about Fuller Street. He told her the number, the real one, and watched her do the same arithmetic he'd done and arrive at the same terrifying total. He waited for her to tell him he'd lost his mind. He wouldn't have blamed her. Half of him wanted her to, so someone would say aloud what he feared. Instead, Margarita was quiet for a while, her thin hand on the blanket, and then she asked him only one question. She asked him if, should he fail, he could live with having tried. Carlos thought about the door at Overin Foods and the sound it made closing, and the years of green numbers that had counted for nothing, and the folded card he'd been too afraid to read for so long. "If I fail," he said slowly. At least I'll have failed at my own thing, not someone else's. His mother closed her eyes then, and something in her face relaxed, and she told him that was the only kind of failure worth risking. She'd spent her whole life failing at other people's things, she said, at jobs that used her and let her go. And if she had one regret, it was that she'd never been brave enough to fail at something that was hers. She told him to go build the thing. She told him she intended to be well enough to taste it. He went back to Fuller Street the next morning with a toolbox and no clear idea where to start, which is the honest condition of every person who's ever started anything that matters. He tore the butcher paper from the windows that same day, and light entered that dead room for the first time in months and fell on the worn path in the tile where Nora had stood for 30 years. And Carlos understood that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, at the beginning of a path he'd chosen, rather than a path chosen for him. He had no customers. He had a crumbling building, a shrinking account, a mother in a hospital bed, and a reputation in town that ran precisely in the opposite direction of everything he was about to attempt. By every measure Meredith Vance would have recognized, by every number on every report, Carlos Mendoza was a man who had just made the worst decision of his life. He rolled up his sleeves, found the one working oven, and began to learn how to make things right. Not almost right. Exactly right. At the one thing he'd always wanted to do. The first month nearly broke him, and it did so quietly, the way real difficulty usually arrives, without drama, just a steady accumulation of things that were wrong. The bakery on Fuller Street had been dying longer than its sign had admitted, and each morning Carlos discovered a new symptom of that long decline. The proofing cabinet wouldn't hold heat. The thermostat on the second oven lied by 40 degrees in either direction, depending on its mood. A pipe under the sink wept a brown stain onto the floor, and the front door hung crookedly enough to scrape the frame and announce every entry with a complaining sound. He fixed what he could with his own hands because he could no longer afford to pay anyone else. The savings that had once been a wall between his mother and disaster were now a thin stack of bills he counted more often than was healthy, and every repair came out of that stack. He learned to solder. He learned which parts he could salvage and which he had to replace. And he learned to do the replacements at 2 a.m., when the day's bake was done and the town slept, and there was no one to see a former quality control manager lying on his back under a leaking sink. He kept a schedule that would have frightened the men who once called him careful. He was at the bakery by 3 in the morning, mixing and shaping in the cold before the one working oven reached temperature. He baked until dawn, sold through the day, cleaned in the afternoon, and repaired through the evening, and drove to the hospital in the gaps to sit with Margarita and let her believe, by the steadiness of his face, that things were going better than they actually were. She wasn't fooled, but she allowed him the pretense because she understood it was the only rest he was getting. The town didn't make it easy. The Word had already decided who Carlos Mendoza was. And the Word doesn't update for anyone's convenience. People who'd heard he'd abandoned Over-In Foods now heard he'd sunk his last dollar into the Fuller Street bakery, and the two facts sat together in their minds and formed a single conclusion. The man's judgment wasn't to be trusted. They said it the way people say such things in a small town, not to his face, but in a way designed to reach him. A bakery that failed under an owner who knew what she was doing wasn't going to be saved by an unemployed man with something to prove. He heard the doubt in the bell over the door, which is to say, he heard it in the long silences when the bell didn't ring at all. There were mornings when he baked 40 loaves and sold 6. There were afternoons when the only sound in the place was the ticking of cooling racks and his own footsteps on the worn tile, walking the path Nora had worn before him. And in those afternoons, the arithmetic in his head grew loud and specific and cruel, and he had to stand very still and remind himself of his mother's only question and the answer he'd given. What saved him in the end wasn't strategy. It was the bread. He'd spent those brutal weeks doing the one thing he'd always known how to do, which was to insist on the difference between almost right and exactly right, and he'd turned that insistence into his own recipes with a focus that bordered on obsession. He tested flours until his hands knew the good ones by feel. He learned the exact hour a particular dough wanted to be shaped and the exact minute it wanted to leave the oven. And threw away everything that was merely good in pursuit of what was right. He wasn't a trained baker. He was what trained bakers too often stopped being, which was a man who cared about every loaf as if it were the only one. The first customers who came in out of curiosity, half expecting to confirm what the town already believed, found instead a crust that broke the right way and a crumb that tasted of something remembered rather than something purchased. They came back the next day and brought someone. That's how it began, not with a flood, but with a rumor that finally ran in the opposite direction, one honest mouth at a time. Nora was among the first regulars, which surprised him because he'd assumed the woman who'd sold him the place would want to forget it existed. Instead, she came twice a week, sat at the small counter by the window, and told him the truth about what he made, which was the most valuable thing anyone gave him in those months. She told him when a crumb was sentimental rather than good. She told him one grey morning that he'd done something with the old place she'd never managed, and that she hadn't expected to be glad about it, but she was. By the start of the second month, the mornings that had sold 6 loaves were selling 30, and the bell over the crooked door had begun to ring in a way that no longer felt like a rarity. It wasn't success. It was survival with the faint outline of a future in it, which for a man in Carlos's position was almost the same as hope. Meredith Vance walked in on an ordinary Thursday and didn't recognize the place or the man in it because she'd never truly looked at either. She'd come to the area as part of one of the market studies she conducted personally, because she trusted no one else to read a neighborhood the way she believed she could read a spreadsheet. She'd parked on Fuller Street by accident. She'd seen a bakery with a modest line at the counter and entered out of professional habit, scanning anything that appeared to be working. She was noting foot traffic, the price board, the small efficiencies of the room, when the man behind the counter looked up, and his expression shifted from evaluation to something cooler and more self-satisfied. "So this is where people end up when they can't hold down a real job," she said with a weak laugh. The same laugh she'd used on the open floor at Overin Foods, the one that required an audience for completion. Carlos recognized it instantly, and something in his chest tightened, and then he stood very still. He wore a white apron dusted with flour. His sleeves were rolled. His hands were flour-dusted to the wrist, and he understood in a single clear moment exactly what she saw and exactly what she decided it meant. She looked at him the way a person looks at a cautionary tale that has conveniently arranged itself for her inspection. She remarked that she supposed everyone had to land somewhere, and that it was almost appropriate, really, that a man who couldn't keep the job she'd given him had found work baking for someone else. She said it was good that he'd found something, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. She was certain, as she was about most things, that she was looking at the final chapter of Carlos Mendoza's story, and that the chapter was small and slightly pathetic. Carlos didn't correct her. The impulse was there, sharp and immediate, to tell her the name on the lease was his, that the bread she was standing next to was his, that the small line of people behind her had come for something he'd made rather than a paycheck someone had given him. He held the impulse and let it go. He'd spent years being defined by what other people decided about him, and he'd learned in the last 2 months that the fastest way to lose was to argue with a conclusion rather than outlive it. So he served her. He asked, in the same even voice he used with every customer, what she'd like. And when she said she was just looking, he nodded and told her she was welcome to look as long as she liked. He wrapped an order for the woman behind her. He wiped the counter. He treated Meredith Vance precisely as he treated everyone who crossed his door, with a simple, unhurried courtesy that gave her nothing to push against. And his refusal to push seemed to unsettle her more than any defense could have. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for him to explain himself, to make his case, to show her the wound she assumed she'd left. When he did none of these things, she made a small, satisfied head movement, the gesture of a person confirming a theory, and left as she'd come, sure she'd seen a man at the bottom of his descent. The bell over the crooked door rang behind her, and Carlos let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and went back to the oven and said nothing to anyone. The thing about outliving a conclusion is that you rarely know when it's broken. Carlos didn't know that Meredith left Fuller Street believing she'd witnessed his defeat, and didn't know that the same quality that made him serve her without a word was the quality about to change everything. Daniel Reyes walked in 11 days later, and unlike Meredith, he was looking, truly looking, because looking was his profession. He produced a food show that traveled the country finding the small places that did one thing extraordinarily well, the unassuming counters and corner ovens that the guides overlooked. And he had a palate that had ruined most restaurants for him and a stubborn faith that somewhere off the highways, good things were still made by hand. He'd heard about Fuller Street, as everyone heard now, from a person who knew a person, and had driven 40 minutes on a rumor, because rumors were his entire business. He ordered without ceremony and ate standing at the window, and Carlos watched him from behind the counter the way he watched every new face, without expectations, because expectations were a luxury he couldn't afford. Daniel took a bite and stopped. He looked at the crust in his hand as if it had said something to him. He asked who the baker was. And when Carla said he was, Daniel asked where he'd trained. And Carlos told him the truth. Nowhere. That he'd spent 11 years telling other people when their bread was wrong before he learned to make it right himself. Daniel Reyes didn't hide his astonishment, and he wasn't a man given to it. He told Carlos that in 15 years of driving county roads on rumors, he'd tasted a lot of good bread, and very little of the other thing, the thing that can't be taught. And he was tasting the other thing. He said he wanted Carlos on the show, not as a filler segment, not as a local interest curiosity, but as one of the featured artisan bakeries in an episode that would air nationally. And he explained what that kind of exposure had done for places smaller and less remarkable than this one. Carlos stood very still behind his counter and understood that a door was opening, a different kind of door than the one that had closed at Over-In Foods. And that this one he was being invited to walk through on the strength of the one thing he'd always wanted to be judged by. He said yes before his fear could talk him out of it. Daniel gave him a date, just under 2 weeks, and told him the crew would film him working, would film the bread, and would let the food carry the story, because the food, he said, was the story. In the days that followed, the rumor about Fuller Street grew a second layer. And the news reached Meredith, as it always reached her, filtered and secondhand and shaped by the agendas of whoever carried it. She heard that the little bakery she'd walked into was being noticed. She heard somewhere on the broadcast that Carlos Mendoza was involved, and she fit this new fact into the old shape of her conclusion, because minds like hers don't surrender a conclusion easily. A desperate man had taken a low-level job at a bakery, and the bakery was getting a moment of attention. And that was all. It didn't change anything about the man. She still believed, right about him, and being right was what she protected above almost everything else. Then, 4 days before the filming, everything Carlos had built began to fall apart at once. The second failing oven, which he'd nursed for 2 months with solder and patience, finally died in a way no repair could fix. And it died on a night when he needed every inch of oven space he owned to be ready for a national crew. He stood in front of it at 1 a.m. with a flashlight between his teeth and his hands black with grease, and understood that a new oven cost more money than he currently had, and that the money he did have was already earmarked for his mother's care, and that he was looking at a choice no man should have to make 4 days before the biggest opportunity of his life. The next morning, the second blow landed. His flour supplier, whose particular mill he'd spent weeks learning by feel, called to say the delivery he'd built the entire filming around would be late. Very late. Possibly not until after the crew had come and gone. Everything Carlos had planned to make, the loaves that had earned him the invitation in the first place, depended on ingredients that were now on a truck somewhere far from Fuller Street with no promise of arriving on time. He sat on an overturned crate in the middle of his quiet bakery with the grey light before the town was awake. And for the first time since he'd torn the butcher paper from the windows, he felt the full weight of how far he'd come and how little held it up. The oven was dead, the flour was gone, his savings were committed, and the only chance to prove to the town and to himself and to a woman who decided he was finished that he hadn't been finished at all was 4 days away and dissolving in his hands. He thought about the door at Over-In Foods and the sound it had made. He thought about his mother's question, whether he could live with having tried, and understood, sitting on that crate with the light coming over Fuller Street, that he was about to find out exactly how much that answer was worth. Everything he'd bet was on the table, and for one long grey morning, it looked like he was going to lose it all. He didn't let himself sit on the crate for long, because grief and arithmetic were luxuries 4 days couldn't afford. What he had instead was the only thing the last 2 months had taught him, which was how to be exactly right under pressure, and he began methodically to solve the disaster in the order it could be solved. The dead oven couldn't be resurrected, and there was no money to replace it. So he made the hard choice to stop looking for a new one entirely and work with what he still had. He thought about the single oven that had carried him since the first week, and did the harder arithmetic of what one oven could produce if the man running it didn't sleep. It meant staggering everything, baking through the night in careful waves, one batch cooling while the next fermented, a schedule so tight it had no room for error. He would have to be flawless for 4 days on almost no rest. He'd been flawless without rest before. He knew the shape of it. The flour was the crueler problem, because no amount of will could bake bread with ingredients sitting on a late truck. He called the supplier again, and didn't raise his voice because raising his voice had never solved anything, and instead asked clearly whether there was any part of the order, any partial load, that could reach Fuller Street before the crew arrived. He was told there might be a smaller amount available at a closer warehouse. Not the full mill he'd built his plan around, but something close enough that a man who knew flour by feel could make it work. Close enough wasn't a phrase Carlos would ever have accepted in 11 years of quality control. But the last 2 months had taught him a second lesson, that insisting on perfection was useless if it left you with nothing at all, and that a great baker wasn't a man who demanded ideal conditions, but a man who could find the right thing hidden inside what was barely adequate. He accepted the partial load. He drove to the closer warehouse. He loaded the sacks into his truck himself by hand and brought them back to Fuller Street in the dark. Then he did what separated him from the man he'd been at over in Foods. He put his hands on the new flour and learned it. He mixed small test batches in the small hours, adjusting water by feel, reading the dough the way Nora had once read it across the empty floor, chasing the right result through a substitute he'd never planned to use. It took most of a night and a lot of flour he could barely afford. But somewhere before the third dawn, he found it, the hydration and timing that made the inferior mill behave like the bread that had earned him the invitation. He barely slept in the days that followed. Nora walked in on the second morning, saw the dead oven and the grease still on his hands and the particular hollow around his eyes, and without being asked, took over the counter so Carlos could stay at the work table. She didn't offer sympathy he couldn't afford to receive. She offered work, which was the only kind of help that served him then. And the two of them ran the little bakery through its most important week the way it had always been run. By hand, on no margin, on the stubborn belief that doing things correctly still counted for something. The morning the crew arrived, Carlos had been awake for most of 2 days, and the bakery smelled the way he'd spent 2 months teaching it to smell. Daniel Reyes walked in ahead of his cameras, looked at the racks of finished loaves cooling in the grey light, and didn't know that Carlos never told him that 4 days earlier, everything had nearly collapsed. He didn't know about the dead oven, or the late truck, or the flour learned by feel in the dark. He only saw the bread, and the bread was exactly right. And the bread was the story, just as he'd promised it would be. They filmed Carlos working, his hands in the dough, his sleeves rolled and his forearms white to the elbow, and filmed the crust breaking the way a good crust should break. Daniel asked him on camera the same question he'd asked in private, where a man learned to bake like that. And Carlos gave the same answer, nowhere, that he'd spent 11 years learning the difference between good and right before he had the courage to make something himself. It wasn't a polished answer. It was a true one. And the camera, which forgives almost nothing, forgave him completely. The segment aired 3 weeks later, a Friday night, and it wasn't long, no more than a few minutes within a larger episode, but it did what Daniel had spent 15 years driving county roads to find. It found the quality that couldn't be taught and put it in front of the whole country. It showed a man with flour on his hands and no training and no safety net making bread that a professional palate had driven 40 minutes on a rumor to taste. And underneath the food, it told the oldest and simplest story, a person who'd lost everything and refused to stop. The response didn't build slowly the way the town's trust had. It arrived all at once, overnight. The way only a national broadcast can deliver. The next morning, there was a line outside the crooked door on Fuller Street that stretched to the corner. People who'd seen a few minutes of television and driven from 3 counties away to taste for themselves. Carla sold everything he had by 9, and baked frantically to sell it all again by noon. The bell over the door, which had once been silent for entire afternoons, now rang so constantly that he stopped hearing it as a sound and began hearing it as weather. The town that had decided who Carlos Mendoza was updated its verdict, the way towns do, quickly and without acknowledging they'd ever held the other opinion. The man who'd sunk his last dollar into a dying bakery was now the man who'd put Fuller Street on the map. And the same mouths that had doubted him now claimed cheerfully, and without irony, that they'd always known there was something special about that place. Carlos let them. He'd learned that outliving a conclusion meant letting people rewrite their own memories, and that arguing with the rewrite was as pointless as arguing with the original. Meredith Vance caught the segment by accident, the way most turning points happen. She was in her apartment on a Friday night with the television on for company, more attention than work. When the food show cut to a small bakery she recognized before she understood why. Then the camera found the man behind the counter, his sleeves rolled and his hands white with flour, and she went very still. It was the same apron. It was the same man she dismissed on Fuller Street, the one she decided was baking for someone else, whose defeat she'd been so sure she'd witnessed. And then the show said his name and named him not as an employee, but as the owner, the baker. The man who'd made what the whole country was being told to want. She sat and watched the rest of the segment without moving. She heard him say he'd trained nowhere. She heard him say he'd spent 11 years telling other people when their work was wrong before making something of his own. And she understood, with a slow, unpleasant clarity, that those 11 years had been spent in part at her company, on her floor, reduced to a green line on a report she'd never bothered to read closely. She'd had Carlos Mendoza's ledger in her hands, and she'd only seen a missed audit window, and thrown the rest away without ever knowing what the rest contained. What landed on her wasn't that he'd succeeded. Meredith respected success. It was the only language she'd truly been fluent in. What landed on her was that she'd been wrong, specifically, and publicly, and in a way she couldn't spreadsheet her way out of. She'd fired a man for caring for his dying mother, and called it reliability. She'd stood in his bakery and laughed at him for a job he didn't have, for a defeat he wasn't experiencing. And he'd served her without a word and let her leave still believing it. He hadn't needed to correct her. The truth had simply outlived her, exactly as he must have known it would. She went back to Fuller Street on a weekday, deliberately early, before the worst line formed. She stood across the street longer than she'd have admitted, watching people carry white paper bags out of a door she'd once walked out of triumphant, and then made herself cross and enter. The bell rang over her as it now rang over everyone. Carlos looked up from the counter and recognized her, and whatever he felt, he didn't show, because he'd spent a long time learning not to.